Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 19th of April of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians attacked Ukraine with significant number of missiles, and there were very heavy explosions all over the entire southern part of Ukraine. The explosions took place in the town by the name of Pavlograd. We don't have videos, but we have some photos. And this is very important photos because the photos show us that the Russians start bombing and attacking the railway facilities. So not just the, let's say, energy facilities, not just the military objects, the Russians start bombing railways and the railway stations. And this is very important because, as we can see, the Russians have changed their, let's say, approach to the special military operation. In the previous phase of the special military operation, the Russians were bombing just the military facilities. But now we see the Russians start bombing not just the military facilities, but any single facility that can have double use. For example, what does it mean double use? From one side, it can be used as for civilian purposes. From the other side, it can be used for the military purposes. And when talking about the railway stations in like the town like Pavlograd, the Russians in the past would never attack this area, but now they understand that Ukrainians use this territory for redeployment of forces from one part of Ukraine to another. So that's why this is the legal target for the Russians. So Pavlograd was under very heavy fire and lots of damage the Russians managed to deal. Furthermore, the sources published additional photo and additional videos from, let's say, Dnipro itself. We have some, let's say, pictures, some videos of Russian missile strikes, and as a result of attack, the Russians managed to destroy and to damage the bus station. Currently, we don't know for sure how exactly the Ukrainians were using the bus station, but probably it was the area of concentration of armored vehicles maybe, and light vehicles, and maybe infantry and troopers as well. We have some videos, some, let's say, blurred videos from the Ukrainian side. People want to stay safe, so that's why they could provide us just this, let's say, video. We see the result of strike with the very heavy, we can see the very heavy explosion. And the resources later also published us the video from the bus station. We see a lot of big signs of explosions and so on. For now, once again, I reminded that we don't know for sure what exactly the Russians managed to achieve as a result of these strikes, but very likely that maybe the Russians managed to get another concentration of forces or another, let's say, command center of armed forces of Ukraine who is responsible or was responsible for Zaporozhye and southern direction. But to summarize everything, of course, Dnipro and attacks in Dnipro is not something that started today or yesterday. Dnipro attack was something that finished something, let's say, the row of strikes that were conducted by the Russians and the Ukrainians as well. I'll remind you once again that this entire situation with missiles and launches and attacks started on the 17th of April, so 2 days ago, and everything started with Ukrainian attacks on Crimea using the ATACMS missiles. Once again, let's take a look at this video. The Russian sources reported that there were around 12 missiles that Ukrainians launched on the Crimean Jankoe airfield, and as a result of those strikes, according to the Ukrainians, they managed to destroy a significant number of S-300 systems and many other things. But during the first day, we didn't receive anything when talking about geolocations confirming the significant Ukrainian progress. And 2 days, and the 18th and the 17th, we didn't receive anything. So now we start making conclusion that maybe the Ukrainians were spreading the fake information. But just today, on the 19th of April, we received the first geolocations confirming that Ukrainians managed to break through the Russian air defense and to deal significant damage to the Russians. We have fresh satellite photos, let's say, aftermath of the strike, and according to the photos, we can make a conclusion that yes, the Russians lost a division of S-300 or S-400 systems. Significant number of these air defense systems were destroyed as a result of ATACMS strikes. I'll remind you that as a result of act of revenge, of act of response, the Russians attacked Chernigov, the northern direction, and as a result of that attack, the Russians managed to get the command center of a group of forces north of armed forces of Ukraine. Currently, we don't know for sure what the Russians managed to achieve by that attack, but probably they could, let's say, cut the head of this group of forces. And today, on the 19th of April, the Russians finished the missile strikes by attack in Dnipro. And before that, once again, the Russians managed to suppress Ukraine air defense by destroying the S-300 systems and the radars in the vicinity of Dnipro. And after the Russians destroyed the S-300 system and the radars in the vicinity, the Russians also destroyed significant number of MiG-29 aircrafts and An-26 aircrafts as well. Today, the Russians, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, gave us another, let's say, report, let's say, for the previous week. And in that report, they included the information of that strike, and they're saying that they managed to destroy up to three MiG-29 aircrafts. The Russians destroyed up to 4 An-26 aircrafts, and also the Russians destroyed 4 S-300 systems and 1 IRIS-T system. But IRIS-T system, I'll remind you, was destroyed in Kharkiv area during the previous week, not in Dnipro area. When talking about Dnipro, just S-300 systems were destroyed. During all these things, Zelensky was evacuated to Europe, and he was, let's say, all together with Stoltenberg, with different politicals from Europe, and the Europeans tried to keep him as far as possible from the danger zone, to keep him in the safe area. I'm not sure what they're going to do after the 21st of May, when Zelensky is not going to be a president anymore. Maybe they will not, let's say, evacuate him anymore, and maybe they will force him to start elections. Anyway, we're going to see this just in, let's say, in a month. Now let's move to the situation on the ground. Let's start from, of course, the most important direction, from Avdiivka area, where the Russians continue offensive operation in direction of Ocheretin, Novokalynove and Ceramic. So, if you remember, we were talking a lot about these territories, these footholds in the past. The Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt to collapse the defense of 115th Mechanized Brigade, and the Russians managed to dig in deeper on the outskirts and the first trenches and fortifications of Ocheretina. But the Russians couldn't move further because the Ukrainians, from their side, managed to concentrate and to redeploy a significant number of reserves with the purpose to stabilize the situation and not to allow the story to repeat Avdiivka, let's say, defense operation story. So, but this is not a big problem for the Russians, of course. When they realized and when they saw a significant number of Ukrainians, they decided to fall back. They stretched their forces and digged in deeper. But from the other side, the Russians start doing the things they're doing the best. They start pummeling and reducing Ocheretina to ruins. On this video, we can see the first videos, the first geolocated videos confirming the Russian use of FAP-500 and the different multiple launch rocket systems on the direction of the village, trying to suppress and destroy the Ukrainian positions in the southern part. So the same story as we used to see in Krasnogorovka. I'm not sure that the Russians are going to attack the start offensive, let's say, today or tomorrow, but obviously that after a week of such a heavy pummeling, the Russians will launch an offensive with the purpose to establish complete control over the southern part of the stronghold. So once again, the main Russian goal during the next few weeks or days or months to establish control over this territory, and also not just over this territory, but also to establish control over Novobakhmutovka, and of course, and finally for the Russians, to establish complete control over Berdichi, because we see that the Russians managed to move very far to the north, but they still have lots of unresolved and significant problems on the south of the foothold in the village by the name of Berdichi, which is, for now, as we understand, something like uncrackable nut for the Russians. So we'll see what is going to be next, but the sources today reported that the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainians' defense belt in Ukrainian positions, and according to some more or less reliable sources, the Russians have already established control over this part of the Berdichi, but for now, no geolocations, no videos confirming this. We just have few FPV drone strikes on Ukrainian forces, and that's it. So we'll see what is going to be next. Now we are moving to Ceramic and Novokalynove area. The Russians, after they managed to establish complete control of the southeastern part of the stronghold, start clearing the territory, clearing the villages with FPV drones. So the Ukrainians also managed to concentrate significant number of forces with the purpose to slow down the Russians, and the Russians start bombing the Ceramic, the town by the name of Ceramic, with FAPs. Significant pressure, very difficult to understand how the Ukrainians are going to hold on this direction under such a heavy pressure. Very likely the Ukrainians, after a few weeks of such a pummeling, will be also forced to fall back from Keramik and Novokalynove further to the north in direction of Arkhangelsk. So I'm not saying that this is going to happen tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, but obviously Novokalynove Keramik is going to fall, and as a result of these attacks, the Russians will be able to establish control over this territory. And after that, we can start counting days not just over Chiretina or, let's say, I don't know, other towns and villages on this direction. The most important, we will be able to start counting days of Arkhangelsk, and very likely that the Russians, if they can, let's say, develop this offensive, will be able to enter Arkhangelsk even earlier than entering Chiretina itself. So very complicated situation for the Ukrainians. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Ukrainians have redeployed the forces of 47th Mechanized Brigade from this direction towards, let's say, Chasiv Yar or towards Kupinsk area. So the Ukrainians, for some reason, decided to reduce the number of experienced forces on the area, and probably without replacing them by, say, some other forces or something like this. Anyway, the situation, as we can see, is very complicated. Furthermore, when talking about Pervomaiske direction, today the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation confirmed once again that as a result of offensive operation, they managed to establish complete control over the village. We got this report a few days ago. Today, during the weekly summary, they confirmed this information once again. Currently, we still haven't received any reports or updates about this artillery pocket that located to the south of Pervomaiske and to the north of Nivoyska. Furthermore, according to some sources, the Russians, as a result of offensive, managed to enter Nitailova itself and managed to establish control over the first street and the first buildings in the area. So this approximately the control of armed forces of Russian Federation on this direction. Novokalynove, we haven't received anything during the previous 24 hours, just we see that the focus is moving further to the west. Now the Russians are not bombing, let's say, Novokalynove itself. Now they're mainly concentrated on the eastern outskirts of Konstantinovka or with FABs on the northern part of Konstantinovka. It looks like the Russians are getting prepared for further offensive operation, but now not in direction even of the western of Novokalynove, but in direction of the eastern Konstantinovka. Vuhledar, we have lots of updates during the previous 24 hours. We have more geolocations confirming Russian attempts to attack in direction, let's say, from Salotka to Vodyane. The Russians were using significant number of armored vehicles, personnel carriers, and so on, but the Ukrainians managed to repel that attack, and the Russians, having losses, were forced to fall back. But different mappers also adjusted their maps, showing that as a result of that maybe not so successful offensive, the Russians managed to establish control over this, let's say, stronghold. So by some mappers, this is approximately the area of Russian control, let's say, by the end of the 19th of April. So for now, we don't have geolocations confirming this. Vuhledar, the Russians continue clearing, let's say, the southern, let's say, the village to the north, the residential area farms to the north of Pavlovka with FPV drones. The Russians are pretty focused in this area. So the configuration of the icons, the configuration of Russian activity tell us, first of all, that yes, the Russians will start an offensive in direction of Vuhledar, and the farms and, let's say, industrial area to the north of Pavlovka is going to be, let's say, one of the Russian primary targets during the upcoming Russian offensive. So this is exactly approximately what the Russians are planning to establish control over during the next, let's say, attempt to attack towards Vuhledar. So if we increase the numbers of updates since the beginning of April, we can see a certain Russian focus in this area. We see Vuhledar is under very heavy fire. So based on all these geolocations, based on the number of icons, we can make a conclusion that this is approximately the small Russian plan to get as close as possible to Vuhledar. Probably as soon as the Russians manage to reach the to the distance of the, let's say, tank attack or mortar attack to the road of 0524, and this is exactly what they are doing right now on the line between Salotka and Vodyane. But for now, without, let's say, significant results or significant progress. Now we are moving to Bakhmut, Artyomovsk direction, where we also got significant number of updates, and the most important is that Zelensky arrived to the stronghold. He started giving awards, let's say, rewards to the soldiers, trying to encourage them to fight with the Russians. He came to Chasiv Yar not today, he came to Chasiv Yar a few days ago before he left to Europe, trying to hide from Russian missile strikes. He came to Chasiv Yar trying to stabilize the situation after the forces of 67th Mechanized Brigade capitulate, let's say abandon their positions, and basically let's say were the reason of significant defeat of armed forces of Ukraine on the direction. Zelensky arrived in the area, and according to tradition, if Zelensky comes to this or that town, that means that within the next months this town will be captured by the Russians. So maybe something like this is going to happen here as well. We got additional geolocation from Bakhmutovka itself. The Russians established control over a few more buildings on the line, on the street, on the line between Bogdanovka and Kalinovka itself. The progress is not so big, the movements is very slow, because the Russians are always under very heavy fire from the Ukrainian FPV drone operators, so that's why they can't move very fast. Furthermore, the Ukrainians, let's say, managed to concentrate reserves to redeploy critical mass in this area, trying to stabilize the situation. Obviously, they will not be able to stabilize the area, but at least the Ukrainians will be able to win some time. And according to Western, let's say, press, we know that Ukrainians can't win. The only thing they need is to hold till the end of the year, probably till the end of the elections in the United States of America. And after that, there may be a completely different situation with, let's say, endless support and supply from the Western countries, from the United States of America itself. So we can't tell for sure how exactly this is going to happen, but they need to survive till the end of the year. So, and this is exactly what they're doing, regarding and despite the losses they have. And now we are moving further to the north in direction of Siversk direction. We have certain Russian activity in Bilohorivka. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians tried to attack the Ukrainians once again. The Russians were moving from the Lysychansk oil refinery. They were planning to, let's say, make a tricky attack. They was trying to get these trenches, and then let's say, the Ukrainians did not for sure where exactly the Russians are going to move further, either in direction of Verkhnykamianska, or maybe the Russians had plans to attack to the north in Bilohorivka. So that was like a tricky attack. During the previous days, the Russians were pummeling heavily the Ukrainian positions with FPV drones, with artillery, with aviations, with RBK 500. The territory was under very heavy fire, and after those attacks, the Russians conducted an offensive, but the thing is that everything, let's say, was ended almost at the beginning. The Ukrainians also concentrated a significant number of FPV drones, and the Russian attack was stopped even without reaching the main stronghold between Verkhnykamiansk and oil refinery. Significant number of drones and significant number of losses of armored vehicles from the Russian side. But when talking about armored vehicles from the Russian side, it seems that the Russians don't care how many tanks and armored vehicles they lose, because their production is obviously something that can be compared with anything. For example, today we got more details and more videos of another batch of let's say T-80 tanks that the Russians finished production on the territory of Russia. It's a heavy T-80 tanks and a significant number, hundreds of tanks. The Ministry of Defense inspected another, let's say military plant, inspected another production, and in the end of the video we can see how this factory sends another batch to the line of combat contact, completely fully loaded with the new electronic warfare equipment, with the additional defense against the Ukrainian FPV drones and many other things and features. Furthermore, we have more videos from Crimea itself, from Russia itself. More and more T-90 tanks the Russians are sending to the line of combat contact. So sometimes it seems that if Ukrainians destroy one tank, during this day the Russians are able to replace the tank and to build additional 3 or 4 units, so something like this. So for now, for the Russians, tanks is not something important. For the Russians, is more important to have, let's say, high technologies equipment, like planes, like let's say reconnaissance, like satellites, like technologies. This is the most important. The Russians understand. They managed to concentrate and they managed to create the critical mass for production. They can produce anything that you want. They can produce these steel machines in endless numbers, but they understand now that steel can't win the war. They need technologies, they need AI, they need something more, something bigger, and something more perfect than they have right now. And now this is exactly what the Russians are investing their money, their time, and they start creation robots, as we discussed, and so on. And the final thing about the situation, Zelensky went to Europe, as we know, and probably one of the topics that the Western countries currently discuss with Zelensky is the peace negotiations. But today the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russian Federation, Lavrov, stated that even if Zelensky decided to start negotiation with Russia, and Russia is always for negotiations, this will not stop the combat, the clashes on the ground. So the Russians will continue offensive until the signature established on the list of capitulation or something like this. And this should happen, of course, before the 21st of May, because after that the Russians will not recognize Zelensky as the legal president, and he will not have legal power to sign any agreement with anybody. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.